Hey everyone, so today's lecture is about plate tectonics. And so quickly, let's review the geosphere because plate tectonics has a lot to do with how the geosphere functions. And so remember, geo means earth or rocks. And so when we're talking about the geosphere, we're talking about the solid earth. And when we're thinking about plate tectonics, it's really important to remember that Earth is a differentiated planet because it's separated into different layers. And what that means is that we have different layers of Earth, and we can talk about them based on their chemical composition or their physical properties. And we're thinking about Earth's interior, right? The inside of Earth, and what it's made up of. And so the compositional layers of Earth are the crust, the mantle, and the core. So the crust is the outermost layer, underneath that is the mantle, and the center of the Earth is the core. And again, compositional layers are based upon the chemical properties of the material in that section, right? So what that section chemically is made up of is how we determine those three different layers. And then we also talk about Earth's layers by how they act physically. And so we call those the physical layers. And again, that's based on their physical properties. And so the outermost layer is called the lithosphere. Remember that lith means rock, right? So this is the rigid layer. Then under that, we have the asthenosphere, which is a plasticky layer, the mesosphere, and then the outer liquid core and the inner solid core. So if we're talking about that internal structure based on chemical composition, the crust is the outermost layer. It's relatively thin compared to the entire size of the Earth. The dominant chemical composition of the crust is granitic and basaltic. So just things that have lots of silica in them. So these are lighter materials. So on Earth, the lightest elements are found near the outside, and then as you go farther and farther into the Earth, into the center of the Earth, those elements get heavier and heavier. So the mantle is the middle layer. It is dominantly composed of a silicate mineral that is a little bit denser called peridotite. And then the core is the innermost layer. It's the center, right? Just like you have a core of an apple. And it is mostly made up of metallic iron, right? So even though it only makes up 16% of the volume of Earth, it has about 32% of the Earth's mass because that iron is so dense and heavy. And then if we're thinking about Earth's physical properties and how we might divide it into layers based on its physical properties, we call the outermost layer the lithosphere. Remember, lith means rock, so this is literally the rock sphere. This is that rigid, solid outermost layer. It includes all of the crust and a little bit of the top of the mantle. The asthenosphere is the weak sphere, and it's called the weak sphere because it's kind of flowy. It's a little plasticky and easily deformed. And that's because the temperature is just right for the rocks to begin to melt, but the pressure is not high enough to keep them solid. And so we have rocks that are just starting to melt. They're maybe a little liquidy. They're soft and easy to deform, but I don't want you to think of this as like a liquid layer. It's still solid. It's just easily deformed, easy to smush around. And we hear about the lithosphere and the asthenosphere in this concept of plate tectonics, and we'll get into that more in depth as we go through this lecture, because that hard outer layer, the lithosphere, is moving around on top of this plastic layer of the asthenosphere. The mesosphere is the middle sphere. Here is where we have high enough pressure to offset the higher temperatures, and so it is strong, rigid, solid, unlike the asthenosphere. We have a liquid outer core and a solid inner core. And there's a lot of heat trapped in the middle of the Earth, but it's radiating outward from our inner core. And so from our solid inner core, we have heat getting lost, and that, along with Earth's rotation, causes convection within the liquid outer core. And the liquid outer core and moving around because of this convection is what generates the Earth's magnetic field. So that's why we have a North Pole and a South Pole, and we can use compasses, the magnets and compasses, because of our liquid outer core. So the objective of this unit is to understand how plate tectonics developed as a theory and the mechanisms and parts of the tectonic system. So first, let's start off by talking about continental drift and plate tectonics. So just some vocabulary. Tectonics is the study of the origin and arrangement of broad structural features on Earth's surface. So that's sort of this overall term of how Earth's surface looks and why Earth's surface looks the way it does. And then plate tectonics is a specific scientific theory about the Earth's surface being divided into a few very large and thick plates of lithosphere. So remember, lithosphere is that hard, rocky outer layer of the Earth that's moving slowly around the surface. And those plates are interacting with each other, and they're changing in size relative to one another. And a lot of our landscape features are the result of the movement of these large plates of lithosphere. So the plate tectonic theory in environmental science was developed in the late 1960s. And so it's a relatively new theory to the field. So I always had a professor in college who was, close to retirement. He's retired now. And he would always say, like, when I was your age, we didn't learn plate tectonics in college. We learned a different theory, right? So this is something that still people who are working in the field of environmental science maybe didn't learn when they were going to school. But the basis of the plate tectonic theory, which is something called continental drift, was largely developed by a meteorologist called Alfred Wegener in the early 1900s. And so he noticed a lot of things about the world and the landscape that made him think that the continents were moving around. And so he measured continents moving away from each other with survey methods of the time. So he was able to detect Greenland moving away from Europe with those early surveying methods. He noticed that the Atlantic shorelines appear similar. So Africa and South America look like they fit together. And not only do they look like they fit together, they also have similar rocks on both of those continents. He noticed that there were, in addition to similar rocks, similar fossils on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and similar climate zones in ancient rocks. So we can use rock deposits to understand what the climate used to be like, whether there were glaciers there or whether it was tropical or a desert environment. And he noticed that those appeared to fit together. And then he noticed that there was something fundamentally different between the composition of continental crust and oceanic crust. Specifically, he noticed that they have different elevations where continental crust is much higher than oceanic crust is. So Wegener had quite a bit of evidence for continental drift, but there were some problems with his proposed idea. And specifically, he did propose a way that continents were drifting, right? So he had quite a bit of evidence that the continents were moving around based on the way that the rocks and the fossils in those climate zones looked, based on the facts that the shorelines appeared to fit together, like maybe they were one continent in the past. And he noticed those fundamental differences between continental and oceanic lithosphere, and he actually detected movement, but he couldn't explain very well why this movement of the continents was occurring. And so he proposed, one, at the time, we didn't know anything about what the ocean floor looked like. So he thought maybe they just moved, through the ocean floor, just plowed around, and tidal forces were able to drive that motion. But scientists didn't really accept that mechanism, and so his whole hypothesis was rejected because he was unable to explain how the continents were moving around. So even though he had some evidence for continent movement, he was not able to explain the mechanism. He couldn't explain why it was happening, and so at the time, this hypothesis was largely rejected. And so that was in the early 1900s. Flash forward a couple decades to the 1960s, and we have the acceptance of something called plate tectonic theory. And so plate tectonics is derived from this original concept of continental drift, but the difference is that the mechanisms to explain why the continents are moving are very different. So Wegener's evidence was essentially correct, but he was unable to explain how the continents moved well enough for it to be accepted in the scientific community. And so it took quite a long time for this, for there to be enough data to develop the plate tectonic theory. But this was essentially a revolution in geology. The worldview in geology before then essentially thought that the continents and the oceans had always been where they are today. And with this new theory, we were able to clarify a lot of things that were hard to explain before we had plate tectonic theory. And so this is considered one of the unifying theories of geology. It's a really important theory of geology. Okay, so we have plate tectonics, and it's a theory. And we have the seafloor spreading hypothesis, which is the mechanism of plate tectonics. And we have a whole slew of evidence for seafloor spreading. I'll go through this list and then we'll talk about each one in turn a bit. So ocean floor topography, what the ocean floor looks like is evidence for this hypothesis of seafloor spreading. How sediments accumulate on the bottom of the ocean, where earthquakes occur, where volcanoes occur, paleomagnetism, which is magnetic particles in rocks, and then something called polar wandering. So those are the 6 pieces of evidence for seafloor spreading. So let's talk about ocean floor topography. So in the 1940s, during World War II, we developed sonar, which was really useful in World War II because it enabled us to find submarines. But sort of this side use for it that we started to use after the war is that you can use sonar to figure out what the bottom of the ocean looks like. And so we have a whole bunch of new evidence of what the bottom of the ocean looks like. And what we noticed is that in the middle of some ocean basins, we have these ridges. So in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, we have something called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And it's this high place in the middle of the ocean. Right before we had sonar, we just thought the bottom of the ocean was flat. And then we have it's generally fairly flat most of the time. And then close to some continents, we have a really big trench. right? So we notice that we have these mid-ocean ridges, so this relatively high place in the middle of the ocean, and then close to some continents, we have this deep trench. So here we have a topographic high, the mid-ocean ridge, and then we have a deep trench near land. Volcanoes create weird patterns, and usually they're associated with these trenches and mid-ocean ridges. Next, we noticed something special about how quickly or how much sediment is accumulated on the bottom of the ocean. And what scientists notice is that in the middle of the ocean, near that ridge, the sediment is much thinner. And on the outside of the ocean basin, near continents, we have much thicker sediments. And sediment accumulation in the ocean generally happens at the same rate through time. So you can use it to figure out how long the ocean floor has been there. So if you have thicker sediment, there's been more time for that sediment to accumulate there. If you have thinner sediments, you've had less time for sediment to accumulate. So along our mid-ocean ridge, we have very thin sediment accumulation. And as we move away from it, we had thicker and thicker sediment accumulation. All right, the next piece of evidence for seafloor spreading are earthquake patterns. So if we didn't have any lithospheric plates on Earth and everything was pretty similar, and things weren't moving around, then we would expect earthquakes to have no pattern at all, just to have a shotgun scatter pattern where they're just kind of equal all over the place, but that's not how we actually see earthquakes occurring. We see earthquakes occurring mostly in these weird linear patterns on maps, and they line up with that weird mid-ocean ridge that we mapped on the ocean floor, and they line up with places where we have deep trenches. And so earthquakes have a pattern that appears to be associated with some of that ocean floor topography. So notice that here we have this linear pattern of earthquakes, and it lines up with this mid-ocean ridge here. Here near the continents where we have some trenches, we have lots of earthquakes. So very similar to earthquakes, we also have a pattern of volcanoes, and most volcanoes occur in a linear pattern as well, either along the mid-Atlantic ridge or other mid-ocean ridges, or along those places near those trenches that we see next to the continents. Okay, so in 1960, a scientist named Harry Hess published something called the seafloor spreading model and proposed that the seafloor spreads apart in the mid-ocean ridge. At the mid-ocean ridge here, right? So at the mid-ocean ridge, the seafloor is moving away from itself, splitting in half, because here we have upwelling mantle, like upwelling magma, active volcanism creating new lithospheric crust. And so we have seafloor spreading where we're creating new crust, and it's moving outwards from that ridge because it's spreading. Then somewhere that older crust has to be recycled. Right, so here's our mid-ocean ridge where we have seafloor spreading occurring. At those trenches near the continents, this is where we have our old ocean floor being recycled into the mantle. You can also see we have earthquakes occurring both at those trenches and at our seafloor spreading zones, and volcanoes, right? We have rising magma here, and also volcanoes in association with our trenches here as well. So we have earthquakes and volcanoes associated with both seafloor spreading and recycling of lithosphere at trenches. Okay, so the cool thing about the seafloor spreading hypothesis is that it is a testable hypothesis where seafloor next to the ridges should be younger than seafloor that's farther away from the ridges. And because this process is actively pushing lithosphere out from the middle of the ridge, they should be symmetric on either side of the ridge. The ages should be symmetric as we move out on either side from the ridge. And so scientists were able to test this using changes in the Earth's magnetic poles. So sometimes when we're talking about the Earth's spheres, one that is included is the magnetosphere. And so the magnetosphere is really important for life on Earth because it actually protects us from a lot of harmful radiation from the solar system and from space. So particularly it protects us from something called solar wind, but it protects us from a lot of radiation from space. And it has to do with the fact that we have a magnetic field. And that, again, that magnetic field is related to the convection of the liquid outer core. And so Earth's magnetic field is just like that of a bar magnet, right? So just like a magnet with a north and a south pole. The Earth also has a north and a south pole. And it's generated from the hot and molten liquid in the outer core that is convecting. So one thing that we need to know before we think about how we can test the age of the seafloor is that Earth's magnetic field is not stationary, and the north and south poles move over time, and we call that polar wandering. So if you've ever used a compass and you had to set the declination, that's because the geographic North Pole, where Santa Claus lives, and the magnetic North Pole are slightly different. And so the declination is the difference between geographic north and magnetic north. And our magnetic North Pole moves around. It has to do with the convection of the inside of the Earth. And so what scientists observed is that the orientation of the magnetism that preserved in rocks didn't match that of the present magnetic field on Earth, right? So apparently the pole has moved over time. And we can see that recorded in rocks and infer that from rocks that we find. And not only has it appeared to change through time, but they looked different in North America and Europe, right? So we have data from North America that plots that polar wandering here, and we have data from Europe that plots that polar wandering here. But if we rotate those records a little bit, the best explanation is that actually those records match up, right? The magnetic pole was only in one place at one time. It couldn't have been in two different places at one time, depending on if you were in North America or Europe. And so the magnetic and rotational poles have remained in the same positions, but the continents have moved relative to each other and to the relative magnetic pole, right? So we can use this magnetic pole data to infer that and support that the continents have moved through time. Okay, so how do we understand the Earth's magnetic field just by looking at a rock? So most rocks contain minerals that have some natural magnetism to them. So think about iron is a mineral that likes to be attracted to magnets. So for when an igneous rock called basalt cools and crystallizes, the direction and the intensity of the magnetic field, when it formed, it's locked permanently into the crystals, right? Because those minerals that are naturally magnetic line up with the current magnetic field. And then as that liquid cools and solidifies, then those are stuck there. And we call that thermal remnant magnetization. But Earth's magnetic field has changed over time. It reverses every once in a while, and we have polar wandering. And so we can use this thermal remnant magnetization of the direction which these iron minerals are facing to infer the age of the ocean floor. Right, so here's a diagram showing you paleomagnetism, which is that we have this lava that's cooling into a basalt. As it's cooling, all of those iron minerals line up with the Earth's magnetic field at the time. And then once it's cooled, that rock locks those locks that rock's dipole into place. And so what that means is that the iron minerals are indicating where the Earth's magnetic field was when that rock cooled. This is super useful to understanding seafloor spreading, but it's also super useful in understanding a lot of other things in geology and in archaeology. So archaeologists use this to understand when past native peoples had hearths that they had heated up enough to effectively change the iron magnetization in that rock. Okay, so here's how we use paleomagnetism to understand seafloor spreading. Let's say we have our mid-ocean ridge, and over here we have mid-ocean ridge at time 1. So in the past we had time 1. We have this layer of blue that we're creating, right? And so the blue has a certain iron, let's say at the time that the blue is created, the magnetic field has a north pole. And so all the iron minerals line up to face the north pole. And then some time passes and we create this green layer. And during the green layer, the magnetic pole is actually at the south. So all the iron minerals are pointing south. And that's recorded in these rocks. And then when we form the red layer, the magnetic field switched back to the north. And so all the iron minerals line up to the north. And so as the magma cools and solidifies along the ridge, it becomes magnetized in the direction of the existing magnetic field. We can go back through time by looking at these rocks. We can go take rock cores from the bottom of the ocean to understand the direction of the magnetic field when those rocks cooled. And what we can understand from that is that the rocks that are closest to the ridge are youngest, the rocks that are farther away are the oldest, and they are symmetric on either side of the ocean basin. Right, so you can do this by taking actual sediment or core samples from the ocean, or you can do this using a magnetometer to see where you have negative and positive anomalies, where you have your minerals pointing to the North Pole or to the South Pole. And we can use this information to actually plot the age of the seafloor, and we can see that the youngest seafloor is along these ridges, and the oldest seafloor is next to the continents. Okay, so what is a plate? A plate is a large, irregularly shaped piece of the lithosphere. Remember, lithosphere is that rigid outer layer of the Earth. And the lithosphere is the crust and the upper part of the mantle. So the lithosphere is rigid, but it can bend a little bit when you have some type of weight on top of it. And that loading or that bending can cause the asthenosphere to flow, and that's what causes the plates to move around Earth. And so, again, the asthenosphere flows plastically when you have some weight or load on it. We have two main types of lithosphere. We have continental lithosphere and oceanic lithosphere. So the continental lithosphere is made up of mostly rocks that have lots of silica in them. It's lighter and it floats a little higher on top of the asthenosphere. Oceanic lithosphere has mostly mafic minerals, so it's higher in iron and magnesium. It's a little heavier and it sinks a little lower into the asthenosphere. And so we have 16 main lithospheric plates, which you can see organized here on this map. And the movement of these plates relative to one another is really what we encompass in this theory of plate tectonics. And so we can describe the three types of interactions of plates, or the boundaries between two plates, in three different ways. So there's three different kinds of plate boundaries. We have divergent plate boundaries. With divergent plate boundaries, this is where we have plates splitting and spreading apart from each other. So our two plates are moving away from each other. They are diverging from each other. I always think of that book, Divergent, right? Because she's different. She's moving away from the crowd, right? She's not like everyone else. And so divergent plate boundaries are where you have plates moving and spreading away from each other. At convergent plate boundaries, this is where two plates are coming together or converging on each other. There's actually three different types of convergent plate boundaries. And then at transform boundaries, we have plates moving next to each other, sliding past each other. They're not moving apart or together, they're just moving past each other. So we have two main types of divergent plate boundaries. We can have divergence of plates on continents, and we call those continental rifting zones. And then once we have divergence enough of that continental rifting, we create a new ocean basin, and then we have oceanic plates moving away from each other. So at divergent plate boundaries, we are creating new lithosphere and the plates are moving away from each other. So here at our oceanic spreading center of our divergent boundary, you can see we have plates moving away from each other and then magma upwelling and creating new oceanic lithosphere. So an example of a divergent boundary is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So as the oceanic lithosphere spreads apart, new seafloor is created through volcanic processes, and we have earthquakes associated with these divergent boundaries, and they typically have a shallow focus, so they occur pretty close to the Earth's surface. Remember, convergent plate boundaries are where we have two plates coming towards each other or converging, and there are three different types of convergent plate boundaries. We have ocean-ocean convergence, and with ocean-ocean convergence, that's when we have two oceanic plates coming towards each other, and that results in what we call subduction, or one of those plates going underneath the other one. With ocean-continent convergence, we also get subduction. This is when we have an oceanic plate and a continental plate converging on each other. The oceanic plate is more dense, and so it's going to sink underneath the continental plate. And then with continent-continent convergence, we get something called collision. So one of them cannot be subducted or pushed under the other one, and so they fight and they stand off. and they collide. And this is where we create really tall mountain chains like the Himalayas. So with ocean-ocean convergence, a really good example of this is the Mariana Islands and the Mariana Trench. And so when we have two oceanic plates coming together, we get subduction or recycling, destruction of the more dense oceanic plate. On that more dense oceanic plate, that's where you're going to have the trench form. And then on the non-subducting plate, we get something called volcanic island arcs. And so this is where we have volcanic islands in association with convergent boundaries. And then because you have a plate subducting underneath another plate, we get earthquakes that range in depth from really shallow to really deep below the Earth's surface. So with ocean-ocean convergence, we get subduction of the more dense plate. Remember, subduction results in the recycling or the destruction of lithosphere, right? So at our mid-ocean ridges where we have divergence, we are creating new lithosphere. At convergent boundaries where we have subduction, we are destroying lithosphere or recycling it. With ocean-continent convergence, this is when you have an oceanic plate and a continental plate. Here we get subduction or recycling of the oceanic plate, and it will always be the oceanic plate because oceanic lithosphere is more dense than continental lithosphere. A really good example of this is the South American coast, where we have the oceanic crust subducting underneath the South American plate, and this is where we have the Andes Mountains and an associated trench called the Peru-Chile Trench. And so when we have ocean-continent convergence, we get a mountain belt that is volcanic, forming on the continent, right? So forming on the non-subducting plate still. And then again, because we have subduction of that plate, we can have earthquake focus from really shallow to really deep. And then with continent-continent convergence, the crust really can't subduct. And so it ends up just crumpling up and thickening. And so we can't recycle it. It does something called over-thickening, and we create large mountain ranges. And we have lots of severe earthquakes associated with this crumbling because one of the plates is trying to subduct and it's just not working. And so you're taking two things that are supposed to be flat and you're crumpling them up, which is a lot of energy and creates severe earthquakes. And then our transform boundaries are when we have two plates sliding against each other. And because there's a lot of friction associated with plates moving past each other, you can get large earthquakes. And a really great example of a transform fault boundary is the San Andreas Fault in California, where the Pacific plate and the North American plate are moving past each other. And the important thing to know about transform boundaries is that continental lithosphere is neither created nor destroyed. It just is sliding past each other. We also get transform boundaries at mid-ocean ridges. So overall, mid-ocean ridges are a divergent boundary, but because the Earth is a sphere, you can't just have a straight line of a divergent boundary. We have to have these divergent boundaries offset by transform boundaries. And I'll show you this in class with a sphere so you can see this. And so because Earth's a sphere, divergent boundaries have to be broken into sort of this step-like pattern, and you get some transform motion occurring at your mid-ocean ridge as well. But overall, again, your mid-ocean ridge is largely a divergent process with these transform faults sort of offsetting where the mid-ocean ridge is. All right, so that's it for today's lecture, and we will do some activities in class to really hone in on plate tectonics, continental drift, and these three main types of plate motion.